Hi all. Thanks for joining us here at the Department of History in Harris Hall. I'm Robin Bates, and I'm talking to one of our newest faculty members, Alexandra Montero-Peters, who is teaching medieval history now in the department. And Alexandra, I've really enjoyed getting to know you as a colleague this past year, and I just thought to put everyone in the picture, how did you come to devote yourself to studying medieval history and decide that was the path for you?
Thanks, first of all, for having me here. I'm very excited. For my medieval history journey, we have to oddly go back all the way to my childhood. I was obsessed with King Arthur. I think I bought every book possible from my local
Mm.
bookstore on that. And for a long time, that's the entirety of what I understood of the Middle Ages was the UK, uh, knights and round tables, dragons, and things like of chivalric romances. And oddly enough, that was enough for me in high school to say, I want to do this forever. I want to study medieval. I didn't know if it was English. I didn't know if it was going to be art history. I didn't know if it was going to be history. I really didn't. But I only applied to universities and colleges that had a medieval studies major or minor. And that landed me at the University of Chicago here, which was my dream. And when I was there, I had wonderful faculty members and also just real world experiences that showed me that the Middle Ages was that. And there's a lot of cool things you can do with King Arthur. But it was also so much more. It was more than Europe. It was more than Africa. It was more than Asia. It had everything encompassed within it. And so, through trial and error and taking different classes in different disciplines, falling in love with different languages, I wound and wove my way to the history department at U Chicago, as well as the Near Eastern Language and Civ department, and completed my degree in medieval history, specifically Iberia and North Africa. And the journey to leaving King Arthur and landing in Iberia has a lot to do with the fact that I am Latina. My family is from Ecuador, and I felt a lot of resonances and parallels with what I saw between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, multiculturalism, multi-ethnic communities, interfaith relations with the history I grew up hearing regarding my own family and the our own journeys through different cultural spaces. So that's in a nutshell how I ended up here. There were a lot of hiccups along the way. Nobody told me how many languages you needed to do this stuff, but I'm glad I loved that challenge.
So you've mentioned that this is a multilingual medieval environment that you're studying, and in particular, because everyone sort of has to specialize, you especially like the Alphonsine Scriptorium, these wonderful illuminated manuscripts that are put together at the court of Alfonso X, the Learned of Castile. And I've seen images from them because I've seen your PowerPoints, but I would never have known they existed were it
Yeah.
not for the fact that you were showing it to us. So how did you stumble across them?
So that's another instance of some form of higher power intervention, I would say, in undergraduate school because again, I threw myself headfirst into medieval Iberia, and you could fall into any myriad number of paths. It didn't
Mhm.
have to be Alfonso X, but we had a visiting faculty member, and she was coming from Spain. This person now is a good friend, a collaborator, and she was an advisor and mentor throughout my entire academic career. And her expertise was she was in an art history department in Spain, but she was a codicologist, which means an expert in medieval manuscripts and how they're put together, their lives, their histories, their contexts, and specifically of Alfonso X. So in this class, we were using facsimiles or two-scale reproductions of his manuscripts in our special collections library. And we were also learning the history about what is the cultural, political, diplomatic context of these manuscripts. So, of course, that knee-jerk reaction is they're beautiful. I fell in love
Mhm.
because they're exquisite. We have ones that are dedicated to astronomy and astrology, and they have some of the earliest representations in the Christian, Latin Christian context of astrolabes and other sorts of um, instruments to track geometric spaces, distance, navigate, all of that. We also have books of games, which is my
Mhm.
particular passion project. So
Mhm.
El Libro de los Juegos is a book of games that has chess, dice games, and things like backgammon, as well as astronomical variants of these things. And these are all richly illuminated, right? So whether it's a history, whether it is a book on precious stones and their attributes, these were enormous expenditures of resources and labor. And we learned that with this expert. Her name is Laura Fernandez Fernandez. I recommend her work. And what I fell in love with was the fact that a large part of Alfonso's manuscript project that he promulgated so that he could liken himself to a new Solomon,
Mhm.
a king with
Mhm.
all-encompassing wisdom. He knows the stars, he knows Roman law, he knows history, and he knows that across many different cultural valences. And so I fell in love with his translations, or he ordered translations done of Arabic manuscripts into the Castilian, not into Latin. There was no
Mhm.
desire to use Latin in this particular context, specifically into his language, Castilian. What he was trying to say to the world was a new language of scientific and intellectual power. And so that's where I began learning Arabic. That's where I threw myself headfirst into trying to disentangle how these Castilian manuscripts still spoke to and imagined the Islamic hit world and the
Mhm.
Islamic manuscripts that came into them through translation, through engagement, through word of mouth. And so that's been really lovely because I can do that not only as like an intellectual historian, but also as a cultural historian, because I can do this not just what was translated and what did they do with those ideas, but also how did that actually, this engagement with Arabic manuscripts impact the art of
Mhm.
Alfonso Scriptorium, because they learned how to show constellations
Oh,
represent human difference through a lot of similar manuscripts from the Arabic speaking world. And so that's been very exciting for me to dive headfirst. And how could you not love manuscripts? They smell,
yeah.
they're fragile, they're hard to get access to, and they have a story. And you can sometimes even see people's fingerprints from 1,000 years ago still on the page, on the parchment. So it's a very visceral experience of history for me.
So these are made in Seville, at least the Book of Games I know was, and they are, of course, very precious for a courtly milieu. But who in the 13th century would have seen these things?
It depended on what kind of manuscript it was, right? So the Book of Games, the fun thing about that is it was really a royal enterprise for a royal audience. So in theory, it was meant to be seen by whomever the king wanted it to be seen by, right? So we don't think many interacted with the Book of Games when it was made in the late 1200s. However, it comes up, and this is part of codicology, studying the life of these manuscripts. It comes up in the private bedchambers of Isabel la Católica, or the famous Isabel and
Yeah.
Ferdinand, Christopher Columbus, this whole period.
Mhm.
Also, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, this
Mhm.
whole really complicated moment in late medieval, early modern history. And she kept this manuscript in her bedchambers and annotated it, we think, because there are definitely much later notations on some of the chess problems that say, "Un buen
Mhm.
juego," or like, this is a good game, and how
Mhm.
fun, like, this is a good one, look at this one. And so you can imagine that this manuscript stayed very close to the royal seat of power, and it saw many different changes across Iberian history. It shares that with some of the other royal manuscript projects that were undertaken in this period, but some of the others had much wider distribution. So his law code,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
7 parts, or the siete partidas, along with his general history, General Historia, or his history of Spain, Historia de España, those were disseminated very widely. In fact, at one point, pretty much every region had a copy of this in Iberia. And with the siete partidas, this law code, while it was never enacted in Alfonso X's lifetime, it sure impacted our history in the United States because it was exported to Louisiana, to Texas, to the places under Spanish dominion, as well as the Caribbean and Latin America, and enacted in part there. So it was a fun fact when I was teaching in Texas to tell students there that part of your law comes all the way back from a Castilian king in the 13th century.
Wow. So, I mean, I know that one of the manuscript that's interested you the most is this book of chess problems. And of course, chess is in itself interesting to the Castilian court, but, and I believe this is out or is soon going to be out in Medieval Encounters. You've written about this not just as something that teaches you how to play chess, but teaches you about what it is to be a person in a universalist courtly milieu. And
Yeah,
how is chess part of that? How does that sort of show you how to be a courtier?
great question. Yes. I will always say I'm not a chess historian. I get lots of eager questions about, well, when did this piece become the, I'm not your girl for this. However, chess has that opportunity, especially the way that it is represented and depicted in the Alphonsine scriptorium, for us to get in a sense of how folks idealized human diversity and the Mediterranean writ large. In fact, beyond the Mediterranean, the world itself, because chess games, just like any game, depict in microcosm philosophies about the world, right? Are we governed by cruel fate and we have no control over our destiny, or do we maybe have some ability to choose? Do we have some control, some free will? And
Mhm.
chess is the perfect embodiment of intelligence and free will. And so, in this book of games, what's really fun about the whole section dedicated to chess is that you get to see these philosophical discourses taking place textually and also iconographically through the illuminations of different scenes of different people playing chess. But you also get to experience how chess facilitates a broader understanding of the world and the people that inhabit it. And so, I am doing with this particular part is I'm looking at these different illuminations, which, like I said, depict people from all walks of life sitting at the chessboard. We have men, we have women, we have Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We have falconers, we have violin players, or at least the medieval equivalent of a violin. We have knights, we have kings of different recognizability. We see Alfonso playing
Mhm.
for sure. And we see things that surprise us in terms of human diversity. There's depictions of a royal black African court that pushes our understanding of what people thought the world looked like and who inhabited it and who was intellectual and courtly
Mhm.
and could participate in this language of power, which chess so eloquently captures. And so the piece that's coming out with Medieval Encounters asks this question, which is what does courtliness have to do with human difference? What does courtliness have to do with race? Because these illuminations beg us to question that white male Christian narrative in very serious ways. There's a court of an Islamic ruler, a Muslim ruler, depicted, as I mentioned, a very ennobled Black African court. One of, I would argue, the first depiction of Mongols in the
Mhm.
Latin West playing chess as well. I already have a piece that was published on this with a co-collaborator. And so chess is a really wonderful vehicle for at least the Alphonsine scriptorium to envision a larger world and to think about a universal language of power, of courtliness, of interconnectivity, while still positioning Alfonso as the expert within this sphere, the intellectual, the master of chess, the master of all the intellectual demands chess and astronomical chess to have on their players. So it's a really complicated worldview that is rich, but once you begin pulling at the threads, it really changes how we think about the hyperconnectivity across the Mediterranean, all the way into Eurasia, even the subcontinent India, right? There's so much there.
So you mentioned these preconceptions about the Middle Ages that you're revising in your scholarly work. Of course, you're also in parallel an educator, and so you
Yeah.
must encounter students who bring in certain kinds of preset notions of what the Middle Ages are and what they will be studying when they sign up to study a class on the Middle Ages. You know, you've
Yeah.
taught at Bowdoin and Texas State, University of Chicago, and now at Northwestern. What is the story that students tend to bring with them? And how have they responded and received the kind of different and more interesting story that you're able to provide?
Yeah, I think the first thing that leaps to mind is how many students are really surprised of how long and enduring Islamic culture is
Mhm.
within what we call the continent of Europe, right? Because
Yeah.
that's a very modern understanding of how we cut our world up into bits and pieces. So to tell folks that from the early 700s until the early 1600s, there was a political force, a Muslim political force in Iberia, sometimes boggles their mind. And it changes how they perceive the ways in which we define Europe, how we define so-called Western culture, where we make distinctions between Islamic and Christian narratives, and also, right, the incredibly rich history of Judaism as well in Iberia, something I often am presenting for the first time to students because that's not often covered in their classwork. And so to see that there is really the opportunity to see a community within Europe that has positive interfaith relations while also contending with the very, very real negatives about how those communities also enacted violence against each other is something that I think pushes students to reconsider how they think about similar discourses in modernity. So I guess that's another preconceived notion is that we have very modern issues and that these modern issues cannot possibly be reflected in 13th century Rhineland or in France or in Italy. And yet, right, we encounter over and over that people have been dialoguing and debating very similar issues about can all different religions live together peacefully?
Mhm.
Can people treat each other and different customs with capacious understanding? All of this is happening. And so in classes like my Intro to Europe, I first want them to appreciate how very diverse the cultures are in Europe and how very much so Europe is part of a system that brings together the Mediterranean, brings together the Black Sea, brings together all the continents, increasingly so with the Americas as we progress through the chronology. And then with other classes that are more upper level and kind of my bread and butter, what I'm really excited about, I bring students in so that we really hone in on these questions of interfaith relations. So that's my Spain of the Three Religions class. I have a class, Race in the Middle Ages, where we talk about and we read sources that I've been told my students are shocked that such verbiage and such ways of thinking existed when maybe they had thought that racism, or racist thoughts are more of a modern
Mhm.
issue. And yet, again, with some of these sources, we can incontrovertibly say that people were grappling with similar hierarchies of power in the 900s in Baghdad, in the 1400s in Italy, right? These are questions that are asked differently at different moments, but still have resonances and parallels. The other thing I really love about teaching and what I love to show students is that the medieval is a lot more accessible than they
Mhm.
think.
Mhm.
And they don't need to have a plane ticket to go to Paris or to go to Sicily or wherever in order to have a really authentic experience and close encounter with the Middle Ages. We have objects at Northwestern that I can teach with that are from the Middle Ages. We have amazing museum collections I incorporate with students, and we do field trips because I knew how important it was for me to have hands-on experiences with these objects. And I want my students to have that same historical empathy and compassion so that when they're writing their papers, it's more real to them. It's
In
less.
fact, I understand you've been augmenting our library collection to
Yes.
improve this experience for students.
Yeah, I think we're really privileged at Northwestern in ways that has not always been the case, at least in my own teaching trajectory in different institutions, to have a well-resourced library. And I think that when we're in a time that consistently questions the significance and importance of maintaining collections,
Mhm.
here's my 2 cents. And that is that we are actively acquiring objects that can help my own research, but also help me pedagogically, help me teach. And so we have some exciting acquisitions that are going through their heavy paperwork to get from Paris to Chicago right now. Those are not necessarily full medieval objects. They're actually a weird hybrid. They're
Mhm.
made by a so-called Spanish forger in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. They repurpose manuscript cuttings from real medieval manuscripts that we can identify. We can say this is a cutting from an antiphony or this is a cutting from a book of hours. But on the other side, this total forger would paint medieval illuminations to then sell secretly, clandestinely on the market, and he inundated Paris and then the world with these tricks, these forgeries. And they were eventually uncovered later on, weaving in the history of some of the first folks to really put money into medieval studies in America. J.P. Morgan, his incredible librarian, Belle de Costa Green, whom everybody should look up, an amazing woman. And so when the ruse was out, then these objects became valuable for different reasons. And that's what I'm excited to bring here because I already have students that want to work on this. I am going to be writing a paper for a collected, an edited volume on this because we can talk about the medieval, but also how we in modernity think about the medieval and treasure it and idealize it and want it in our own collections. So lots of exciting ways to engage with the medieval here at Northwestern and tons of opportunities for our students, alums, other faculty to really get their teeth sunk into this history.
I mean, as I think about this and sort of what you're bringing to Northwestern, it's so impressive. As we close, what's it been like working with our students? How are they comparable to others that you've had dealings with?
They're so excited. I mean, the thing I will say that my students elsewhere, they've also been excited. They've also been enthused. There's always been that joy of intellectual inquiry, but there's something very special about the Northwestern student because they also go the step further and want to be your research assistant and they want to take
Mhm.
time and learn from you. And I've had students come to my office and I have facsimiles of medieval manuscripts and they just want to sit and we go through it and I point out to them how's a manuscript put together. You can see, even though this isn't a real medieval manuscript, I aspire to just casually have medieval manuscripts on my shelves. Until then, these facsimiles bring students to my office. We talk about them and they have such fascinating questions, interdisciplinary ones too. The students I have from engineering and STEM classes that come into my classroom are always so intrigued to learn about how we're using spectrometers to further our understandings of the distances inks and other materials traveled in medieval trade. They want to do that kind of research and I want them to do that kind of research. So this passion for truly interdisciplinary research and then acting on it and wanting to have a closer relationship with faculty, wanting to be in your office and look at it. I get a lot of joy from that because I don't necessarily care what they do after they graduate, but if they have that enthusiasm and that excitement, it really makes me positive and optimistic about where we're going in the future, that
Mhm.
this is the kind of future leaders, future citizens, good citizens that we've got, future global citizens, I should really add, because some of these students too really want to study abroad after classes with me or my colleagues here. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been an amazing experience. Northwestern students are eminently talented. They collect talents in ways I'm envious of. Um, and so it's truly been a joy to come here and be a member of the Northwestern community, see what questions students are asking, what they care about, and have a tiny role in where they go next.
I think we cannot do better than end on a note of such optimism that's grounded in something real. So, Ali, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Rob. This has been such a joy. Thank you.
Thank you.